Assalamu alaykum guys, welcome to another episode of the fairdinkum podcast. Today's episode is also recorded in Perth, and alhamdulilah I had the opportunity of bringing Sheikh Salmaan Parker on the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed this episode personally because not only does the Sheikh dress well, alhamdulilah, but also to me personally his Islamic journey is very interesting. So he studied in many places such as South Africa and Qatar, and he's also learned from different types of teachings and bringing back all this knowledge to spread in Perth. So in this episode, we also spoke about the importance of seeking knowledge, the mannerisms it comes with it, and what you must have while doing so, and also taking the good and leaving the bad when learning from multiple sources. Alhamdulillah, guys, we also hit 10,000 subs, so I just want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned in and supported the podcast over the years. And yeah, enjoy the episode.
In the classes that I held, in the decisions that I made, even in the decisions that I made as far as community decisions, communal decisions, in as far as who to work with, who not to work with, who to collaborate with and not to, and so on, and how to characterize certain opinions over others, and so on. All of these things were shaped in my initial years by the learning that I had done in Qatar. But over time, and it was kind of more a reflexive thing, where I'm interacting with the community, I'm reading much more books, I'm exposing myself to a lot more literature, and that's one thing that I really found very, very beneficial. One of the things we were told at our graduation in South Africa was, you're now graduating, but this is not the end. Ready for marriage.
Sheikh's already put me on the spot. SubhanAllah, what a start. Before we start though, Allahumma barik, I actually like what you're wearing. I want to know where you got the shirt from.
My wife does a bit of my fashion choices. So
oh, okay. Interesting.
Online. I think it was, what's that website? Swiss?
ASOS, no?
No, one of those, one's from India.
Oh, okay.
It's a really famous one. It's just like one of those online shopping ones.
Okay.
I forgot what it's called.
You might have to send it later on, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Alright, Sheikh, welcome to the podcast. Assalamu alaykum.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah, fantastic.
Alhamdulillah. My first, I would say, proper time in Perth.
Yeah.
The last time I was about 16, so it doesn't really count.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start with your journey. I think your journey sounds very interesting, very unique, in my opinion. I'd like to know where it started from in terms of wanting to seek knowledge and where the motivation came.
I think it would be very, very pertinent to start with my childhood, because it begins with a little bit of my father's vision. When he had kids, he constantly used to tell us when we were a little bit older that he always used to make this dua that I don't know what I want to do with my kids. I want them to pursue knowledge. I want them to be in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, I had no idea as to how to do that myself. So he didn't have any avenues, he didn't have an actual structure in place that he had in mind for us. But he really thought to himself, well, I'll just defer this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he always used to constantly make this dua that I don't know what I want to do with my kids. Ya Allah, you take care of them, you nurture them, you bring them up. And that's a dua that he always used to make, and he used to tell us this when we were a little bit older. And from, I guess, that kind of outlook, from that thinking, I was born in Hobart, by the way, so I was born in Tasmania, and my grandparents moved to Australia in 1979 with my parents, with my father. My mum came later when they got married, but they were in Hobart for a little while. I don't remember anything from Hobart, so I was around 1 when we moved to Perth.
Okay.
And growing up, we did a few years here in Perth, and then eventually my father decided to move to Saudi Arabia. So we were there for around 7 years, And one of the reasons why he moved to Saudi Arabia was for work. Obviously, that was a primary reason, but his goal was to stay there and to take advantage of the religious opportunities that a lot of people have access to in Saudi Arabia. So he got in touch with a teacher who taught him tajweed, and he imparted that to us at a very young age. It got us connected with a hifz madrasa in Saudi Arabia, and we started memorizing the Quran from around about the age of maybe 6, 7, around about that age. And that was, you can say, our first exposure to, well, at least having that consciousness that we're doing something for the religion in pursuit of religion and Islam. And I guess that was like my first exposure growing up, so as a young kid. And as we're growing up, obviously at a very young age, you don't really know what is the value of what you're getting and what your parents want for you and dream for you and so on. And this is also another thing which I think I picked up from my father. He always used to say, make sure you dream big, and then pursue it. You might not reach where you see yourself or where you dream to be, but just work towards it and you'll get somewhere. And that was something which I think for me now, looking back, it is something which is really important in the journeys that we all go through. We should be looking at the big picture and having very big, very grandiose dreams, and then work towards them. Work towards them in a very sound, in a very systematic, in a very sensible way, in a very consistent way. And it's really amazing because sometimes, like, a lot of people come to my father and they say, all 4 of your kids, mashallah, huffaz, they went overseas, studied Islam and so on. And it's all a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I also think a lot of the effort and the vision that my father had, he's still not hafiz, by the way. He has this dream of actually completing memorization of the Quran. At the moment he's on, I think, his 7th or 8th juz. He's still going strong.
Allah make it easy for him.
Ameen. And I think that was my first exposure to religious knowledge. 14, the age of 14, you could say, is when 13, I think I completed memorization of the Quran. My elder brother finished when he was around 12. At the time, it was something which was quite new, quite novel for the community. I think he started leading Taraweeh prayers the very next year after he completed memorization of the Quran. So it was, I think it was 12 or 13 when he first led the Taraweeh. As a young kid, and the following year I completed my memorization and I joined him around about the same age, 13, 14. I don't remember the exact age, but it was around about that time.
Okay, so let's put this in a timeline. So you're in Saudi Arabia, basically most of your childhood.
For around 7 years, you can say.
Okay,
7 years.
And then when it came to becoming an adolescent, becoming an adult, and looking towards taking it to the next level, even though there's no next level compared to Quran, but then like as an adult, furthering your knowledge, moving abroad from Saudi, away from your parents, where did that start?
So that was also around about the age of 14, so that's where we left off.
Very
we'll pick it up, alhamdulillah. So at the time it was finished memorization of the Quran, leading the Taraweeh, okay, where to next? So it was, I was around, what age was that? Year 9, year 7, year 8, something like that. And I continued with my schooling. So by the time I was 14, by the time my brother completed his memorization of the Quran, he was 12, we had already moved back to Perth. So I completed 12 juz in Saudi Arabia, My elder brother had completed 18 juz when we returned back to Perth. He completed the rest of his 12. I completed the rest of my 18 while in Perth. And this was, with school, along with school.
Yeah.
And it was something which we, to whatever quality, managed to accomplish this at home. So going to school during the day, and then after school hours with your homework and all your other commitments as a young student, we would complete our portions of memorization of the Quran, your new content, your revision, and then your long-term revision and so on. We had some sort of a system, and one of the things I really, really admire about my father is he's quite organized like that, and he's quite disciplined like that, and he would maintain that consistency and that discipline as far as making sure that everything's done. So 14 that we've completed memorization of the Quran, and my brothers asked, so what do you want to do? And he was looking at different options at the time. One of the options was Medina University, but it was, I think, 1990s, mid-1990s, or a little bit after that. And my father had no idea how to get admission, how to lodge an application. So he was doing his kind of scoping, what are the seminaries and institutions that are available where if we were to pursue further knowledge, learn Arabic, go through the Shari sciences and disciplines, what are the different institutes that are reputable and well known. And at the time, obviously, names like Al-Azhar or Medina University and other places were well-known institutions, but at the same time, my father had no idea how to get into them, how to pursue that. So with the little understanding that he had, he found a place in South Africa. This was in Johannesburg. It's called Darul Ulum Zakaria. And for the first year, and this was kind of like a trial, it was very difficult for my mum because she was like, we're sending him all the way to South Africa. And
I can imagine.
It was a very challenging moment for her, decision for her.
How long, sorry to cut you, how long was that process in convincing your parents? Because for my parents, like my mum is South African, she's from Johannesburg. Okay. She hasn't been back till this day. Okay. And till this day, the whole family hasn't visited, and there's reasons to it because you hear from the news, you hear from the internet, so things that are happening over there that are pretty dangerous. Yep. So how was it convincing your mom?
So I guess most of the convincing had to do with my dad, and I guess we weren't very privy to those conversations.
Yeah.
But I could see, there is a bit of hesitation from my mum's side at the time. But on the face of it, so for her kids, she put on a strong face and she was like, yes, you're going for good and all of that type of thing. So I still wasn't at that stage. I was still at school. My brother was the first one to go. So he went for 1 year for revision of his Quran, because I guess with memorization of the Quran that we had done at home, it was kind of not under the supervision of a hafiz or a qari, or your regular hifz classes or duxis and so on. So it was just at home with my parents. So this was, I guess, the first time, apart from the little bit of time that we spent in Saudi Arabia at the madaris there, this was, I guess, the first time that we're really going out and we're testing the quality of what we had done. So we're spending so my elder brother, he spent a year there first, and he came back after a year. Everyone's happy, and it was like a success, and everything's fine, it's safe. The institution have some good processes in place. They have a nice setup. They have many international students from more than 50 countries. So it was, you can say, the first experience of what it was going to be like maybe a year later when we would both go together again. So a year later, so this was I think in the year 2000 or 2001, I don't remember, one of the 2 years.
Okay.
My father asked me at the end of year 9, so what do you want to do? You want to continue school, or do you want to follow your brother back to madrasa? He had decided he wanted to go back and he wanted to pursue a alim's course, which spans for 7 years. And if I would be going with him, it would be my first year. I'd do the same thing. So I'd do a year of revision of my memorization of the Quran and really make that strong. And after that, I'd be free to either come back or continue with my brother.
And what age did you make that decision?
14, so I was 14.
Okay.
My older brother was 15-ish.
Because I love the fact that your dad gave you the opportunity to make that decision yourself. Because a lot of parents, you see in a lot of the Muslim families, they kind of make decisions for the kids because, fair enough, they want the best for their kids.
Yeah.
They have more experience than the kids. They're very young. You don't know if they will make the right decision, but you're giving them that responsibility and showing that you trust their opinion and their decision.
Alhamdulillah.
So that can really impact you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's also a balance there. So like sometimes, like what I remember a time when I had reached Wal Fajr. So this was much younger.
Yeah.
I had reached memorization of Wal Fajr, and I was really struggling. And I went to my dad, and I'd just given up. I was crying. I was like, I don't want to memorize the Quran. And at the time, he sat me down and he said, yeah, I feel your pain. And like, you know, he kind of consoled me and so on. And he sat me down and he gave me what we would be typically calling a lecture.
Yeah,
but it was a conversation, but my ears were open because it was a time where I had reached out to him and I've said, you know, I don't want to continue memorization of the Quran, and I really wanted to know what his thoughts were on these sentiments that I'd expressed to him. And he sat me down and, you know, he told me about the virtues of the Quran and the great value of what I've achieved so far, and that there's difficulties in life. And, you know, he went through the whole process of kind of making me understand. But obviously at that younger age, you're still thinking, yeah, that's all good stuff, it's all cool, but I just want to stop, you know. You're only thinking about your comfort, you're only thinking about...
it's getting difficult.
It's getting difficult. So at the end of that conversation, what I do remember was, look, we'll do it as best as you can. So like, you move at your own pace. You move at your own pace.
Interesting.
But he also told me, we'll continue memorization of the Quran.
Okay.
So he made that decision for me.
Yeah.
But he made it in a way where there was a balance of the decision that he made for me at that age, and between the conveyance of that decision with love, with care, with understanding. And I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he did that.
Alhamdulillah.
Because it is today that, you know, I look back and I wouldn't be able to meet the teachers that I met when I was in South Africa and then later on when I was in Qatar. And the love I have for the Quran and for qira'at and that whole discipline and the sciences, I don't think I would have reached that stage without obviously the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost, but the balance that was instilled in me, in giving me a little bit of, giving me the opportunity to grow in love for the Quran, and at the same time for me to be able to understand that sometimes the hard decisions that we don't like, they actually really turn out to be very valuable for us. So I think, you know, it was a decision that he made very early on. And then as you kind of grow up, you know, you kind of see the difference or the shift in the nature of parenting as well, and the dynamics of how, as you're growing up, you know, while they're testing your ability to make the right decisions and to think in a sound way. Sometimes your parents, they make decisions for you when you're younger, and when they know that you're at an age where you're not really able to make that decision for yourself, and thinking of your best interests. But later on in life as well, a few years down the line, maybe they'll let you make a decision because now they've kind of understood that, you've reached an age where you're now a little bit more mature. You can understand the value of certain things, and you're kind of tried and tested as well as you're growing up. So what you're saying is correct, but I think at the same time, like, at least in my upbringing, there was that balance that I felt growing up, where as you're growing older, there's a bit more autonomy and so on.
Yeah, I think creating that balance is powerful. I was even talking to my auntie the other day, and because she has two young kids, and she talks about the importance of, like, not in terms of Quran, but in terms of using the word like haram, because if you start to use it so often, that's all your kids are going to remember, and they're going to think that Islam doesn't allow this, doesn't allow that, but then they don't actually recognize the beauty of Islam and the wisdom behind all these decisions that were made for this religion.
Absolutely.
So I think the balance is very healthy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, may Allah reward you that as well for the impact you made.
Ameen.
So I want to know, South Africa,
Yeah.
so how long were you there altogether?
Altogether 7 years.
MashaAllah. Okay.
So it was, the first year was mainly comprised of the Hifz section, where they connected me with a teacher, and we went through the whole Quran quarter by quarter juz almost every day as new content. So it was almost like I was doing Hifz all over again, except that I with a consideration that I had done it before. So it was like I was doing Hifz but much quicker. And I say that because I realized when I got there that the quality of my memorization that I had achieved over that 6 or 7 year period at home, Saudi Arabia, and then in Perth, was not to the standard that is very common in various institutions and seminaries. So it is there that I kind of understood that, okay, look, I'm kind of rememorizing the Quran here. And to my benefit, I had a very strict teacher, and I guess that's relative depending on the type of student you were.
Exactly, yeah, it is.
But I had a really good teacher, alhamdulilah. I'm still in contact with him, obviously not as much as I should be, but that 1 year that I spent, which was my first year, that was spent mainly in understanding that whole culture of being a student of knowledge. Now you're away from your comfort zone. You're not getting all the meals you want every day. You're not able to demand things or have everything, have all your clothes washed for you and ironed and everything, and everything on a silver platter. I think in my first year, the months that I spent adapting and maybe acculturating myself to that new environment had a lot more learning as far as lifestyle and life skills than it had to do with the hifz aspect. Yes, of course, my main purpose there was to memorize the Quran and to revise it over the period of 1 year. But I think the main thing over the 7 years, obviously growing each year in that, was building independence as a person, and really forming myself as far as how to get along with people, even people that are in their thinking diametrically opposed to you, in their temperaments, in their qualities and so on. How do you get along with people when you're living with them 24/7, with all these other students,
different
as well
cultures?
Yes, so it's a boarding school. It's boarding school,
mashallah.
and obviously you learn a lot from those experiences. And additionally, you learn a lot more from those experiences because all of the teachers who you're interacting with and engaging with, they're actually on campus. They're within the confines of the institution. So it's a massive, it's a massive setup. You have your teachers' houses on one end of the whole setup, and you have your classrooms on the other side, and then you have your boarding and your lodging for students, and then you have your mess where you go and have breakfast, lunch, and so on. So it was really a great learning experience, and it really formed my character, I would say, when I came back, and how I operate within the community.
MashaAllah. So you would say you were about 23 coming out of South Africa?
21.
Okay, 21. Yeah. And how was your view of the world and Islam and giving out knowledge? Because 21 years old, you've memorized the Quran at that time, you've acquired a lot of knowledge by such a young age. Yeah. How was your approach to just people's opinion, giving out knowledge? And because there are different teaching methods, maybe with South Africa or with Medina University or such other places. Absolutely. How was that?
So it was, you could say, I was still at a very, you can say, in infancy stage, as far as being able to share knowledge, being able to be effective in the community. So at the point of graduation, you could say maybe the final 1 or 2 years was really perhaps where I put a lot more effort in than my earlier years at the institution. So my first few years, obviously, as far as my results and grades, they were always really good. Yeah. But in the final maybe 1 or 2 years, I would say 3 years, were where I really pulled up my socks, and I thought to myself, okay, this is something which is really valuable here. And seeing that I was 3 years away from graduation, 2 years away from graduation, it was a point where I felt I really needed to give that last push, a strong push, in my studies. Now, the good thing is, where we studied, obviously there are different schools and different perspectives of studying Islam. So you'll have, within the legal schools perhaps, the main well-known canonical schools that still exist and that people still subscribe to. The Hanafi school, the Maliki school, the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school. These 4 schools are considered the types of legal schools which people still follow. Yeah. Right? Now, of course, obviously looking at the early history of legal development, you understand that these are only 4 schools and 4 streams from amongst a plethora of others that existed at the time, which for whatever reason they really went through extinction, and all that remains is remnants of the schools and perspectives that we still have preserved in our literature, which we still draw from and benefit from. But as far as legal schools, these are the schools that people look up to and respect and follow and subscribe to. And perhaps throughout our history, and even studying at the institution, we could see, because it was a predominantly Hanafi-oriented or leaning institution. So the vast majority of our teachers were subscribers of the Hanafi school. And we had 1 or 2 teachers who were Shafi'i as well. So we did a few extra books as Shafi'is, with some of the Shafi'i teachers, in addition to what we were doing in our normal classes. So we had a few extra classes. I remember Sheikh Abdullah Devla as well, one of my teachers who was not necessarily a classroom teacher, but he was someone who my parents had connected with in the past, and because of the lack of the rules at the time as well, no mobile phones and things like that. So we used to go and visit his house once a week and speak to my parents at his house using the phone, the landline at his house. So he was someone who really picked up. So what he used to do was he used to keep an eye on the students and see, okay, these are some of maybe the Shafi'i students, and he used to pick out what he felt were some of the intelligent ones or the ones who had some potential.
Yeah.
And he would offer that, why don't you memorize Bulugh al-Maram with me, which is a collection of ahadith which has been systemized and organized in a legal fashion, using legal chapter headings and so on, and is organized the collection of ahadith in this way. It's a well-known book, it's a well-known text which has been collected by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a well-known hadith scholar. So he would encourage some of the Shafi'i students to memorize that outside the class time, so as an extracurricular kind of learning opportunity with him. So I guess those early experiences were leaning more towards strong madhab subscription as far as legal orientation, and that was something which was kind of instilled very strongly, I would say, in the institution. So you were either Shafi'i or Hanafi, and it needed to be like that quite strictly. That subscription needed to be very disciplined. So I guess those were the teachings that I was exposed to while there. As far as theological schools, so as far as what we would call aqidah schools, what we were exposed to, I guess, was a bit of a mix. Now, obviously, as Hanafis, for those of us who are a little bit aware of the Hanafi tradition and the Hanafi trajectory, the vast majority of Hanafis would be Maturidi, right? As far as their aqidah.
Could you define that in English for some people that don't know the term Maturidi?
Okay, so Maturidi is an eponymous term. Eponymous just means it's named after a person.
Okay.
Right? So, for example, there's an Ash'ari school, right, which is named after a person as well. So that's what we call an eponymous school. So we have the Ash'ari school. So these are just, you can say, systems of interpretation or systems of thinking in as far as how they draw from the sources of Islam, how they draw from the Quran, how they draw from the Sunnah, and what is the system that they use to interpret the areas of theology. So the areas of belief in God, names and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, matters of the unseen, and in a sense you can say how literally or how not literally or how distant away from strict literalism are they interpreting these texts. So that's basically in a nutshell. I mean, I don't want to go into obviously all of the technical details, but you can say the early distinction, or like the distinction that we can make between these theological schools, these aqidah schools, is that they're operating either on the basis of a lot more rationalism or a lot less rationalism. So in a nutshell, within Sunni Islam at least, right, we can divide the theological schools into three broad spectrums. One is the Athari school, or the Hanbali school, or the Salafi school in our times is what it's known as. And you have the Ash'ari school and the Maturidi schools. And these two schools, generally speaking, in a broad sense, they're more rationalistic than the Hanbali or the Salafi or the Athari school. So as far as these theological schools, in a way we were exposed to all. So the good thing is that our teachers, especially when we went through the 6 collections of hadith, which is what we go through cover to cover, and other collections of hadith as well in our final few years, we do go through and we discuss these various theological schools and their different opinions on those tertiary matters and the minutiae of aqidah as well. And we also do discuss some of the early opinions and how they developed later on, and they culminated in a well-known figure of a person who's considered, you can say, the godfather of the Salafi school or the Athari school, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. So in our classes they did discuss his views on matters as well.
Okay.
And of course in many areas they would give preponderance or preference to the Maturidi school in as far as what they view to be the correct position, and we used to go through those discussions. And in a sense you can say the Athari school, at the very least in our institution, it wasn't as I would say as dogmatic as you would find in many other schools. There was some extent of discussion and dialogue. More so than other institutions, I hear, and I guess I've experienced as well a little bit of that. But in that phase, you can say, graduating from that 7-year course, I had developed a perspective which you could describe as a hardcore Deobandi, or a hardcore, from that perspective, where I was, in a sense, anti-Salafi. And I guess that's the beginning of phase 1 of my journey.
And that's exactly why I asked the question about your 7-year course in South Africa, because usually people, when they do go to South Africa or they are studying in general, they stick to one.
Yes.
In a way. So I find it very interesting how you told me, we'll get into it now, how you went to Qatar.
Yes.
And how that impacted your views, I guess.
Yes. So you'd like to know, I guess, a little bit more about that as well. So after graduation, you could say it is, once you graduate, you start thinking a bit more maturely. You start thinking a bit more about what am I going to do? Now I've reached, I guess, the end of the beginning. And I will now be exposed to the community. I will be expected to go back and to serve my community and to do work, and maybe even to serve as an imam or whatever other opportunities might be out there. So it was, I guess, at the point of graduation where I thought to myself, I really need to get a handle on who I am, what my views are, what's my future. And it is at that point that I became a little bit more decisive. Like, until that point, I was like, yes, decisive, but you're still young. You're still kind of hot-headed. In a sense, you're kind of impulsive as well. You're just like, I can go with the flow. And I guess one of the appeals of going away and studying overseas is just to experience life a little bit more. Just to have a little bit of fun, so to speak. So I guess my initial motivations for going to South Africa and studying Islam was not as strong as it would be after I graduate. So
that's very interesting. Why is that?
Only because I was like, when I went to South Africa, I was kind of at that age where, Islam's cool, I want to study it, and it was something I wanted to do. But it wasn't the only motivation. The other motivations were, yes, I get to experience life a little bit. I'm with my brother, I'll get new friends. You're at that age where you kind of, you're not thinking in the same way that you would be thinking as a more decisive adult, as a more mature adult. So at the point of graduation, which was, I think, the end of 2007 is when I graduated from South Africa, from Johannesburg, from Darul Uloom Zakaria. And it was a little bit before this time, so it was in my 7th year, where my father consulted me on what I wanted to do after I graduate. You want to come back and do your secular studies, do university? Do you want to get married? Do you want to wait? Do you want to do further Islamic studies? And I think at that time I was very clear about what I wanted to do in my final year in South Africa. I said I want to get married. That's the first thing I want to do when I graduate. Yeah. And with a little bit of discussion also with my father in as far as how that will work out, in as far as my ability to support my family and so on. So there was a little bit of discussion there as far as how that could be worked out. And alhamdulillah, as far as having that strong support network always, even till now, alhamdulillah, as far as advice or whatever it is, your parents are always there for you, your grandparents and your immediate relatives. Yeah. So I decided to get married, and I decided that after graduation I want to spend a little bit of time at least doing some further studies in Islamic studies, and to get a taste of what it would be like to study maybe outside that bubble of Darul Uloom Zakaria. Yeah. And one of the options on the table was at the time where my father was working, which was in Qatar, in Doha. Okay. So he was there for almost, I think almost maybe 20 years. Working there for almost 20 years. And I had the opportunity to go where he was staying, and to find some opportunities there to study one-on-one or to specialize in certain areas with some different teachers. And so I spent around about 1 year in Qatar with teachers of a completely different orientation.
And how was that initially when you got there? Did you have those expectations where you knew what you were not getting yourself into, but what you're coming towards and what you're going to learn?
Yes. So, my line of thinking was a little bit like this. So at the point of graduation, you could say I was very much Deobandi, kind of anti-Salafi. Yeah. But the reason why I was interested in the other side, so to speak, and I was ready to entertain and be open-minded to that, is once again also because of my father. He's been through, obviously growing up in India, he's experienced various different movements and various kinds of orientations of Islam as well. My grandfather was very active in the Jamaat al-Tabligh. So he would go out and visit masajid and so on for weeks on end sometimes. So he was involved with that movement for a very long time, alhamdulillah, even here in Perth. And I guess he was a pioneer here also. So because of my family background, I wasn't very, very close to the idea. So I thought, I want to study further, I want to specialize further, I want to see different teachers. And at the time, I guess, I respected my father's opinions as well. So I guess the teachers that he sought out for me while he was there, because obviously he knew the landscape a little bit more and so on, he connected me with teachers who were of the Salafi mindset. Yeah. And so I got an opportunity to study with them for almost a year.
And how was that process of that year learning from a different aspect?
So I know it happened gradually because that's how things happen.
Yeah.
But gradually I was turned.
Yeah, I could imagine. That's exactly why I want to know details.
So you could say, the more I got into understanding the thinking, the mindset, the opinions that were really the bedrock of the Salafi understanding of things, as far as their theology, but even as far as, you can say modern directions that the Salafi movement had taken in as far as their understanding of legal perspective as well, was something that really gave me a little bit of insight and opened me up, to a whole new world of understanding Ibn Taymiyyah and other scholars and more modern scholars of the Salafi movement as well.
Yeah. And so you were there only for a year.
Yeah.
And so that year, the plan was to come back to Perth eventually and obviously spread what you've learned.
Yes.
I want to know what's going through your mind, like through the 7 years of South Africa, 1 year of Qatar, going through different ways of learning and learning the religion, and in terms of what you're moving towards, in a way.
Okay, so it's been around 15 years since I've returned back to Perth.
Okay, not sure.
And the time that I spent in Qatar, you could say, because it opened me up to a whole new arena of understanding, reading the books that many Atharis and Hanbalis, Salafis look up to, reading those books firsthand, I was leaning more towards a very strong Salafi identity at the time. In a sense, I would say an identity which was very anti my previous phase.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you can change so quickly as well.
Yeah. And I don't know why that happened. I think I was always motivated by what I understood to be the pursuit of truth, whatever that means.
Okay.
And I was, in a sense, always willing to explore, very adventurous. And leaving Qatar though, and moving back to Perth, it gave me the opportunity to be a little bit aloof from my teachers in that direct sense, that direct contact that you have with your teachers and people you look up to and people you respect. It does really rub off on you, and it should. It should shape your character. It should really improve you. It should have that impact on you. Otherwise, what is the meaning of change? What is the meaning of learning if you're not changing as you're coming across new things?
Yeah.
Right. So, returning back to Perth gave me the opportunity to be a little bit detached from those bubbles and to really interact with the community. And although right at the beginning of my work, when I returned back to Perth, my first maybe 1-2 years, I was very much influenced by the Salafi mindset in my approach to things, in my teachings, in the classes that I held, in the decisions that I made, even in the decisions that I made as far as community decisions, communal decisions, in as far as who to work with, who not to work with, who to collaborate with and not to, and so on, and how to characterize certain opinions over others, and so on. All of these things were shaped in my initial years by the learning that I had done in Qatar. But over time, and it was kind of more a reflexive thing, where I'm interacting with the community, I'm reading much more books, I'm exposing myself to a lot more literature, and that's one thing that I really found very, very beneficial. One of the things we were told at our graduation in South Africa was, you're now graduating, but this is not the end. This is just the beginning. You've just received the tools of knowledge. Now your actual journey of learning begins. And that really stuck with me. That really stuck with me even after I left, the bubble and the comfort zone of just relying on the opinions and the perspectives and the advice of your teachers, and just relying on that completely without having to independently think and to independently experience. But when I came here, very quickly, as I was exposing myself more to the community and more to the scholarly heritage as well, even beyond what I had learned in a formal way there in South Africa and in Qatar, it really opened my eyes up to many things.
Hang on a sec, you guys are not subscribed. I think you guys, before you start the video, make sure you subscribe, turn off the notification bell, and enjoy the rest of the video.
And some of those things that it opened my eyes up to was that some of the literature that we have from our great and amazing rich heritage of scholarship is quite vast. It is something which has a lot of nuance. It has a lot of technicality, and it has an amazing amount of sophistication. A level of sophistication that is perhaps very, very useful in this complicated world that we live in. And I only realized that when I was exposing myself more and more and more and more, and I continued to learn. I continued to learn through, I guess, in a way on my own, but obviously with teachers, with different people, and by networking with, I guess, my peers and my colleagues and those people I also look up to, not just locally, but also building my networks interstate and internationally as well. I had the opportunity to kind of hear what they have to say and really benefit from their experience as well in their communities. And I think that whole this idea of being very strongly associated with a particular understanding or a particular school or a particular movement is a very naive approach to things, especially as a person who is supposed to be leading the community and solving many problems for the community, so to speak. I felt that there was a lot in my learning journey which I was doing wrong at the beginning.
That's not easy to admit.
It's not, but it is something that we need to do. It is something that we all need to do as people who are involved in different work, right? Imams need to do this. Just recently we had a sit down with Sheikh Umar, some of the imams and so on. And he was saying something really, really interesting, that a lot of imams and a lot of our ulama and mashayikh, we also need to detox.
SubhanAllah.
Like there are many things that we pick up from our learning and that we take for granted, and we kind of we don't realize these are some of the blind spots that we have, and we need to really sit down and be very reflective about what we are doing and where we are heading. And I guess, from that time onwards, I've only kind of looked forward, and you know, my understanding now is that the journey of learning will never end, especially when we have such centuries of amazing things which our scholars have left for us to benefit from, and then to benefit our communities as we live in the modern world as well.
Isn't it interesting when you start to dive into certain topics and knowledge in general, whether it's Islam or not, Islamic knowledge, when you dive into it, you start to realize how much you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas I know people, let's say for example, I went to Jordan maybe like 6 years ago, and I only went for 8 months, and Arabic wise, that's not that much.
Yeah.
So a lot of people heard I went for 8 months, I came back, oh mashallah, you probably like memorized Quran, this and that, and that's their opinion from the outside. Whereas I'm inside and I know what's going on, and I realize how small that is in comparison to what else there is to learn.
Absolutely.
Not to scare people, but then it just shows like you start to realize the more you learn, how much you don't know and how much you might be wrong.
It's really valuable and interesting what you say. I have a younger brother, Abdullah. He's someone. He's the youngest of the brothers, but he's someone who I really respect and admire. Obviously, we have our informal relationship as well, but he's someone I look up to with reverence. Like, you know how like you look up, like I look up to my parents with reverence, my grandparents, my teachers with reverence. I'd conduct myself in a very respectful way, and I'll change my demeanor and so on when they're in my presence and so on. You get what I mean? So it's like that type of reverence I have for my younger brother. I'll tell you why. Like, you'd be surprised at the amount of times I have seen someone asking him a question, and he's like, he's graduated from Medina University as well, has come back and mashallah serving the community in his own way. And you'd be surprised at the times he's been asked a question and he'll just say, I don't know, go to someone else.
And that leaves someone just confused,
and
because they expect answers.
Very confused. And the thing is, like, sometimes it's the type of questions where, like, no, I know you've studied this in your Hanbali textbook, man, what are you talking about? And he'd still give a response, I don't know. And it's really true what the old scholars say, like, إِنَّ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ أَن تَقُولَ لَا أَدْرِي. It is from knowledge that you say, I don't know. And that's why you'll find, very well-known incidents that have taken place with people like Imam Malik and others as well, where, they were not very shy to say, I don't know, or to show that I'm ignorant. I hesitate to answer this question because I don't have enough insight for me to give you, which I am comfortable to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with, and to say that I did this with knowledge. So, we have these inspirational figures of the past, but I think also we have people to look up to in our communities who we can see and hear, and we can experience the type of conduct. In a way, it's a code of conduct, and a student of knowledge really needs to have a code of conduct which they adorn themselves with. It is a difficult journey, but yes, it's a learning process, and a part of that learning process is to understand your limitations and to own up to those limitations as well. Like, it's not the end of the world to say I don't know, or I made a mistake. You make mistakes, and in that you also give other people the opportunity to say that, look, we're only human as well. As imams, as mashayikh, we're human, we make mistakes, and it's okay to be open about those mistakes, because then also people will be able to learn that even though in a way they see us as representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the inheritors of the Prophets, although they carry that huge burden, they're able to see that, the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is much greater than our personalities and our egos.
So, Sheikh, what I would like to ask about regarding your journey, I want you to give some advice to someone or people that want to start their journey in knowledge. Let's say living in Australia, because it's not that easy to go overseas and sacrifice a year or so to learn Arabic or other knowledge. What advice would you give for people seeking this knowledge with the same, keeping the mindset of understanding there are different schools of thought? And I'll say this as well, I'm starting to realize for Melbourne, my city, that our Muslim communities are very multicultural. And it is a blessing, of course, but then at times you can see that we don't seem to understand our differences, and I think that's one thing that can develop over time. And I feel like, seeking knowledge is the best way through it.
Absolutely. I think you've asked a very loaded question, but I'll try my best to kind of organize my thinking in a way. And inshallah, he can help me do that along the way as well. But yes, multicultural. We have a very multicultural communities, of course, in Perth as well. We have a very multicultural community, a growing community. And I think it's more about how we deal with differences and how we view differences rather than the differences themselves. So for example, we see in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. Right? Now, O people, we have created you مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى, males and females. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا, and we have divided you into different factions and different tribes and different ethnicities. لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you can work to mutually understand each other. Now, one of the things that's really celebrated in the Quran is the difference in languages, the difference in the way we communicate, the difference in cultures. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us that it is from His signs, it is from the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, اختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم, right? Your difference in colors, in your skin colors and races and ethnicities and backgrounds, and also your languages, right? These are differences which are celebrated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and are a sign of the creative power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He tells us these facts, and He tells us about all the different colors and the different stripes and so on, what is the lesson that we learn? One of the lessons that we learn is, of course, that as human beings, with these differences, with these stripes, with the plurality of various things, right? As human beings, as Muslims, as those who are committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the example of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, one of the things that we learn is these differences are there for us to learn, are there for us to understand each other, are there for us to maybe capitalize on these differences in a positive way, and not to make them issues that will divide us. And that's why you find, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ, he saw the ugly side of tribalism, he said, إِنَّهَا مُنْتِنَةٌ. And this was something which, like amongst the Sahaba, there were the Ansar and the Muhajirin, and the labels that were invoked in their opposition to each other, in bringing a friction between each other, was Ansar. Ya lal Muhajirin, Ya lal Ansar. The banner was raised that, all the Ansar get together. But what was the intent? The intent was that all of the Ansar, let's get up and rile up against the Muhajirin. All the person who made that call, he said, rile up, O Muhajirin, against the Ansar. When initially these labels, Muhajir, it's a great term, it's a commendable term, it's a beautiful label that was given by the Prophet ﷺ, that was given in the Quran, right? So these labels were initially something that was used for good and that was praised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and yet when it was misused, The moment it was misused, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, it's disgusting. Innaha muntina. Right? So when we understand this, when it comes to race, and backgrounds, and cultures, and languages, and cuisines, and food, and so on, and as Muslims, we do really understand the importance of learning to get along and being mature in our relationships and our engagements when it comes to these issues. Let us also make that transfer of thought from that and extend that to the religious arena. And I'm not saying that there are harmful methodologies or there aren't harmful methodologies, that there aren't areas where there will be people and movements who will go to excesses in certain things. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that the differences we have sometimes, we need to be able to have at least some trust on the scholarly community in as far as their credentials, their learning, their track record, and especially when they tell us that, especially those who are very erudite, very learned, and very deep in their knowledge and very specialized in their different areas, when they come to us and they tell us, hey, wait a second guys, these differences in aqidah, these differences in legal issues and law, right, they're not a big deal. Even though, we have a person who's beginning Ramadan, ending Ramadan, having a Eid on this day, with moon sighting, local moon sighting, global sighting, calculations, whatever it is, right? When your imams are telling you that, hey guys, it's not a big deal, the only reason why we have these differences, we don't really have a unified government to tell us and to impose that on us, right? They're telling us, guys, we don't really have a central authority which makes things easier just by universalizing a verdict or an announcement or something like that. We have each masjid on its own, and that's what we kind of have to work with. And sometimes when those imams and those of experience amongst us, they're trying to lead the way, it's important that the masses and the general community who are relying on their leadership, they also learn to follow through with their leaders, with the advice that they're giving. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is, as a student of knowledge, or as a consumer of knowledge, also, right? It's important to not begin on these sectarian lines. That your approach and your outlook to learning is not that I've already decided who's deviant and who's not. Your approach to learning is I don't know, and that's why I'm doing this, right? And one Sahabi, Abu Darda radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he says something very simple. It says this in 2 words, but it's really something that needs to sink in. He says, "Al-ilmu bit-ta'allum." I'll repeat that again. Al-ilmu bit-ta'allum. Knowledge is by learning. It's as simple as this.
Yeah.
And sometimes the simple is not really enough for us. Sometimes you're like, I'm going for Umrah, what do I say in the tawaf? Nothing, just make dhikr, recite Quran, not much prescribed. Maybe in the last corner just say, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً. We have narrations which say it's recommended to say that in that last corner between the Yemeni corner and the black stone. No, but I want something like give me something to say. I want something more sophisticated.
Yeah.
So that
something super
that whole
detailed. Yeah.
So that whole mindset sometimes of I need it to be more complicated than what you're telling me. Sometimes it really pushes us backwards. When people like Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, he gives us a very simple formula for knowledge. He says, أخي لن تنال العلم إلا بستة. My brother, you won't be able to attain knowledge except by 6 things. سأنبئك عن تفصيلها ببياني. Let me elaborate on on those 6 things. And then he says, ذكاء وحرص واجتهاد وبلغة وصحبة أستاذ وطول زمان. ذكاء, your kind of intellectual aptitude, let's just say, your intelligence. A person who has a particular intellectual aptitude will be able to maintain themselves and sustain themselves through that journey of knowledge. You need a certain mind, a certain kind of mind, because what you're doing, I mean, essentially, as a person who's pursuing knowledge, it's a little bit beyond a person who's a abid and a zahid, and sometimes we mix the two. A person who's praying, a person who's leading the taraweeh, a person who's able to make us cry when they lead the prayer, a person who does a lot of dhikr, right? A person who seems to be, very conservative in their approach, and they mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we mistake these things for actual knowledge. Right? And knowledge is not zuhd. Yes, it is one of the things that needs to be attached with knowledge. إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. One of the obvious effects of knowledge is action. Is that a person is actually developing themselves as a person, is much more patient, is much more dignified in their conduct, is really improving themselves as a person, and is what we would call a role model, even in as far as their conduct and as far as their worship as well. And that's why we'll find, for example, a student of knowledge is not a student of knowledge unless he's praying tahajjud. A student of knowledge is not a student of knowledge unless, they are very much engrossed and very much used to those habits of litanies and adhkar, morning, evening adhkar. These are the things which are essential for a student of knowledge, and we're not dismissing that. But what we're saying is, that is not knowledge itself, right? Actual knowledge is through the collation of data. You draw data, you assess data, you assess the evidence, and you do all of these different activities which are involved in the process of knowledge, of building yourself, in understanding what has been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His word, through the Quran, and the example shown to us by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is captured, I guess, in the hadith literature. The sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is drawn from that. But even beyond that, once you understand revelation itself, the aim of understanding that revelation is to kind of understand the thinking process and the application process of how that works in the real world. And that's the more difficult part.
It is.
And for example, a hafiz, the person who's memorized the Quran, is not a person who is a faqih, who is able to give you solutions to your problems, right? Or is able to give you insight when you're at a roadblock. Hafiz is just that. They're able to recite the Quran well, and inshallah, if they've had a really, really good teacher, and they've been a really good student as well, they're able to recite the Quran well, and they're able to recite the Quran with a degree of accuracy that is inspirational and which other people can learn from. But are these people, very competent, such that they're able to give you those complex answers for real world problems?
Yeah, I think people don't distinguish the two.
Yes, and the thing is, everyone has a role, and we're not saying that he's a hafiz, so they've got no use in the world. We're not saying that. We're saying give the right people their due role. And a person who's a alim, a person who's a specialist in fiqh, for example, go to him for fiqh. A person who's a specialist in aqidah, go to him for aqidah. A person who's a specialist in some area, in Islamic finance, for example, into financial dealings, interpersonal dealings, in social issues, you go to them. And, you're rarely going to find, especially in today's world, you're rarely going to find a person who's a polymath. You're rarely going to find a person who is an expert in multiple different fields or in all fields. It's impossible. It's impossible. Even from the perspective of religion, right? Even from the perspective of the Shari'i sciences, it will be hard. You'll be hard pressed to find a person who has mastered everything. And if someone is making a claim like that, it's a very hard claim to make. It's a very hard claim to make, let's just say. And if a person is making that, that would be determined by their peers, right? And you'd hardly find a scholar who is respected by various factions of the community that, only a handful of people around the world who you could say have reached a caliber in the sciences, in the disciplines of the Quran, in hadith, in fiqh, and in the various sciences, and we're able to say, they have a good handle on various sciences such that, they're able to be almost like a universal resource on various different areas. So we kind of really need to understand and take that also into perspective, that scholarship is something which has its niche areas as well. That you might have a alim perhaps who has a good grounding in all the different sciences, a good grounding, a basic grounding in all the different sciences, and then sometimes what they operate as in communities would be just conveyors of knowledge. So what they'll be doing is they have access to the literature, they're drawing from it, and they're translating it in a way for the benefit of the community, and they're giving it out to people. Right? So they're not the ones who produce the product, or they're not the ones who are generating new thoughts, new ideas, and pushing the boundaries. All they're doing is they're conveyors of knowledge, right? And inshallah, they have a role as well. Everyone has a role, but the problem becomes when that role is misplaced, either by the person who is playing that role, or by the community who really raises them to a position which they're not fit to hold. And I think that's where the problem is. But I think the solution is quite simple, in that we go back to the basics. أخي لن تنال العلم إلا بستة سأنبئك عن تفصيلها ببيان ذكاء وحرص. Hirs is basically just passion, your thirst for knowledge. A person who doesn't want something, how will they attain it? Right? So a person needs to keep moving because of their thirst for that thing that they're pursuing. And knowledge is just like that. You're not going to get a job unless you prepare your CV and you go out and you engage with different companies who are looking for employees, who are looking to fill a particular role. You're not going to get that job unless you do that, right? Unless you've got contacts and someone just comes up to you and but in normal circumstances, it just doesn't happen. You've got to pursue whatever it is that you're aiming for. Same thing with knowledge. You need to have a level of passion, a level of drive that keeps you moving in the direction of increasing yourself in that. Wajtihadun, hard work. Hard work. You've really got to put the effort in. It's drive. It's very boring work sometimes, very dry work, but it is something that a person needs to do. If you're going to gain knowledge, you're going to be engaging with a lot of literature. You're going to be reading a lot. You're going to be writing a lot. You're going to be assessing different ideas a lot. You're going to be doing all of these different things, which is very natural in the pursuit of, leave religious knowledge, even worldly knowledge. That is something that is a requirement in worldly knowledge. You won't be a good engineer unless you get through the units and you do your materials unit and your that unit and your this unit, and you get through it well. those who would just be studying on the final night right before the exam would be miles different in as far as their competency than a person who's really doing it on a consistent basis for the whole term and is doing it for the right reasons, to really understand the mechanics of things and how all of these things work. And a person who there's this huge and stark difference worlds apart. Right? So the same thing with religious knowledge. A person who has just gotten by and just graduated from a Darul Uloom or a university, Islamic university somewhere, or private classes over a period of time in a structured course. A person who's in those classes, with any class, I mean, we see this all the time. There are really good students in a class and really bad students in a class, and that's how it works. That competency will be determined by the type and the level of work that they will be able to produce once they start operating within the community. وَحِرْصٌ وَاجْتِهَادٌ وَبُلْغَةٌ. And a certain level of autonomy as far as your finances, as far as having the actual ability to go ahead. For example, I remember when we were in South Africa, we had a program, and this was the qira'at program, 7 qira'at. I'm sure you've heard of the reading tradition, the Quranic reading tradition. So in our 4th year, we had a program which would then qualify you for being a potential student for this program, for the qira'at program, which wasn't open to all the students. So we had the general alim's course, and we had the qira'at program, which was done in the 5th and the 6th year. But the decisions were made at the end of the 4th year. And one of the conditions that my teacher, may Allah bless him, a well-known teacher, Qari Ayyub Ishaq, he is like the... anyone who's done qira'at in South Africa has probably learnt it from him.
MashaAllah.
He's got hundreds and thousands of students, even all over the world. One of the conditions that he would keep, and it was something that he would sometimes, very rarely, he would kind of forego this condition for very specific students. He would make exceptions to this rule. But his general condition was, I won't accept you into this program if you're married. And initially when I heard about this, I was like, what's the relationship between a person being married and being accepted for this program? Like, why this condition of you should be a bachelor, right? In order to be accepted for this program. And he had other conditions as well. For example, like, he had this condition that you had to have a personal and a good relationship with all of your teachers. You need to be doing well in all of your other subjects. He had a few of these conditions, but one of these conditions was you cannot be married. And initially, I had the same exact expression as you had.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused there.
What's up with that? And eventually I learned why. The intensity of that program, because we covered all 7 qira'at with each of their narrators. So you know that there's a qira'ah, and then under each qira'ah you have their different readers or their rawis, which is an own independent reading in and of itself. So for example, you have Imam Nafi', and his reading is represented by Imam Qalun and Imam Warsh. Okay? Yeah. So these 2 narrators, we're doing all, so like there's 7 of these imams, and the sub-narrators, each of them have 2 sub-narrators. So you can say 14 altogether is what we're kind of dealing with for that period of 2 years. And once we started the program, it was really intensive. Like, we would literally, for at least the first few months, all the students who were chosen for that, and we used to work hard, man. Like the year before, in order to be accepted, you had to jump through 100 different hoops to be able to ensure that, hopefully I get accepted. And then once you get accepted, it just starts. You're in the deep end all of a sudden. For a few months, we were staying up until like 3 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. This is after like your whole day of all your other normal classes, right? And you've done all your work after Maghrib as well. You're catching up with all the revision of all your other subjects. Once all of that is done by like 9:30, 10 o'clock, that's when you start doing your extracurricular work, right? So once we got accepted for the Qira'ah program, we were spending hours almost every night for a few months until we got used to the whole system, and then we got more efficient at it. But it was something which, if you had a family, if you had responsibilities, if you had a wife, if you had children, it would be very, very difficult for you to keep up with these studies while still fulfilling the rights that your people have upon you.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of balance. Like, I didn't understand the wisdom behind it. It was not necessarily just to protect and to preserve the integrity of and the quality of the students that will be produced once they complete the program. It was also to maintain that balance in people's life, work-life balance, study-life balance, as they call it, that, in Islam, we also give that credence and that due importance to making sure that you fulfill the rights that people have upon you.
Yeah.
So when you get married, there are responsibilities, there are rights that they have upon you. And if you're making them forego those rights, in a sense, you're being oppressive to your family. You're not fulfilling people's rights. So it was to maintain that on both sides of the equation. وَبُلْغَةٌ, and that's where we get back to it. Like you make sure that your finances are right, that you're not, that you don't have to get involved in very dodgy situations as far as your finances and your loans and your things like that. In order to go and study, you need to make sure that all your things are taken care of and your financing is from halal places and so on. وَصُحْبَةُ أُسْتَاذٍ وَطُولُ زَمَانِ, and the companionship of a teacher, you connecting yourself up with people who've actually gone through that long process and that long journey themselves already. That's one key thing which I find really surprising, to be honest. Like sometimes you come across people who are like, I really like this speaker, and that's great. Everyone has their preferences and their own kind of inclinations in what they like, in as far as style, in as far as methods of delivery. But what I do get shocked with sometimes is how people operate in as far as how flimsy they are with their religion. Because sometimes these are very common sense things. Like, at the very least, a person who you're asking your religious questions to, and you're getting your solutions from as far as your halal and haram, at the very least, I would think that it's common sense for you to be doing your homework, your background check on the person that you're asking. Otherwise, they might be qualified, I just don't know, right? So you move on to someone who you trust, who they've gone through a qualified process in reaching the stage that they are. This is someone who I can trust as far as their integrity, as far as the way they conduct themselves. But number two, also in as far as the qualifications for this role. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? So it's very surprising for me sometimes where, these days it's quite easy to see the background of someone, a person who's well known in the public circuit, for example. It's easy to see what are their actual credentials. And once again, when you base the role that they play on the credentials that they have, then things will be much easier. If a person is hafiz and not something else, then they play that role. A person who has more, then they play that role, right? So I'm not here to dismiss the different roles that people have to play, because everyone has a role to play, right? Even if you have not studied the religion in a formal way, every single person, I believe, can serve Islam. When we see the life of the Prophet ﷺ and their expertise and the contributions of the different Sahaba, this is very, very clear that some of the Sahaba were not engaged in knowledge; they were engaged in military strategizing, right? And they were very good at that. Right? We have Khalid ibn al-Walid, for example, and you had other people who were experts in knowledge, but even sometimes experts in knowledge in what? The Prophet ﷺ would really point out certain people that, you learn Quran from Ubay, or you learn Quran from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and so on. So you have examples like this where there are people of knowledge even within the generation of the Sahaba, but there were only a few who were kind of authorities when it came to Quran. There were only a few as authorities when it came to Hadith, for example. There were only a few who were authorities when it came to different things, right? And yet, even though some of them were serving knowledge or were serving in some other way, they all reached high stations with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they all reached acceptance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the same way, all we need to do is kind of, in a way, human resources, manage that really
exactly.
well. Really need to understand who's good for what, and then we play those roles, also understanding the limitations that we and other people have.
Yeah, it's essentially making the most of what we have, the resources we have. Like you said, doing your background checks first, but then also taking the opportunity with this multicultural community we live in, both Perth and Melbourne. Making the most of it, seeking as much knowledge as you can, and growing together. All right, we could talk all day, Sheikh. Honestly, I haven't been talking much, and you can tell, but I've been listening to you.
That.
No, well, it's fine. Honestly, I can listen to you all day. Barakallahu feek. But we have to end it there. I just want to ask one more thing, where people can possibly reach you or see like classes or things you do.
So I am on Instagram. If you search me up, Salmaan Parker, you should be able to find me.
We'll put that in, inshallah.
I was on Facebook. I think we had that conversation
we did.
a while back. I recently got suspended for, I don't know what. I've been on Facebook for over 10 years, and I was suspended, and I was told it was because I was underage. I had a look at my, my actual profile, and my date of birth is fine. I was reinstated a day later, and then I was suspended again. Wallahu alam. I'm not sure. I'm not a very controversial person.
Maybe you can stick to Instagram then, inshallah.
I'll stick to Instagram. Also Masjid al-Rahman. I mean, I guess there's a Facebook page of Masjid al-Rahman. I am the Imam of Masjid al-Rahman, so I think it's an active page. A little bit less so in the last month because of my lack of access, but I have other admins, inshallah, who would be active on the Masjid al-Rahman.
Perfect, inshallah. Okay, thank you very much. Barakallahu feek for today.
Inshallah,
we'll get another chance again.
Inshallah, definitely.
And I really enjoyed it. Really appreciate it.
Alhamdulillah, barakallahu feek. May Allah bless you and your family, and inshallah we'll see you again in Perth. Hopefully when we visit Melbourne as well.
Inshallah khair, inshallah.